Hi, Anatol.
Hello.
So I'm Anne-Marie Slaughter, the Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton and the co-convener of the Princeton Project on International Security. I'm talking to Anatol Lieven, Senior Research Fellow at the New America Foundation. I and John Eikenberry have just released the Princeton Project on National Security, a report entitled Forging a World of Liberty Under Law, a National Security Strategy for the 21st Century. Anatol Lieven and his co-author, John Hulsman, have just released a book called Ethical Realism. We're going to debate both the challenges and some of our prescriptions for how to address them in American foreign policy. Anatol, why don't you start off with your and John's critique of where we are right now in the world, certainly the administration's handling of some of the challenges you see.
I think it's pretty obvious that the administration's handling has been disastrous. I mean, we are facing what is in effect defeat in Iraq, in part because the administration moved to Iraq and neglected Afghanistan. A good many commanders have been saying in recent months that we could be facing de facto defeat in Afghanistan as well, given the way in which support for the Taliban is rising. We've seen in recent days North Korea explode a nuclear device, a pretty pathetic one, but still this is obviously a very serious challenge to international security and international order. And there doesn't seem, frankly, to be much that we can do about it unless we can bring China into a wholly new approach to North Korea based on a wholly new relationship with the United States. Elsewhere, I think the evidence of American overstretch is also just manifest. If you look at the fact, for example, that America is drifting towards a crisis with Russia in the Caucasus over a territorial dispute in a place called South Ossetia, which only an infinitesimal proportion of Americans have even heard of. And yet, if there is a war between Georgia and Russia over South Ossetia, with America backing Georgia, that this will have obviously very deep and very dangerous implications for Russian behaviour in the Middle East and elsewhere. Meanwhile, in the background to all this, there are other problems which are not being addressed at all. There is the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, with all the implications of that for how we are regarded in the Muslim world and for support of many Muslims for terrorism. And beyond that, there are even deeper and existential threats. Above all, global warming, which the Bush administration has neglected altogether, although, thank God, there are now powerful forces, even within the Republican Party, which are trying to do something about that. So
I think we actually are agreed in this, in that the Princeton Project report on national security, we start agreeing with you that the issues for the 21st century are multiple. We are facing threats from non-state actors, certainly like global terror networks, the danger that those networks would gain nuclear weapons, but we're also facing the purely state-to-state danger of further nuclear proliferation. We're facing a possible implosion in the Middle East. We're facing the possibility of global pandemics that could kill millions and millions of people, as AIDS already is doing, but there are, of course, others like bird flu. The dangers arising from the scramble for energy security and more generally managing globalization and climate change. So we actually start from the same point of view that a really effective national security strategy cannot be focused on one threat, no matter how grave that threat is. It can't be reactive and responding first looking at China on 9/11, then after 9/11 looking at Al-Qaeda, then suddenly North Korea detonates a bomb and we're looking at Iran and North Korea, that we actually need a multi-dimensional strategy that can take account of all these threats. Now you call that American overstretch. What do you mean? Where do you all go with this?
Well, the fact of the matter is that even a country as powerful as the United States is not capable of dealing with all these threats simultaneously. At least not unless it can develop much stronger alliances in various parts of the world, or, on the other hand, to put it a different way, get regional states to take the principal responsibility for dealing with problems in their areas. And a phrase that we use in the book, and that I've used several times in articles recently, is that of de Gaulle. He said that to govern is to choose, and to choose usually between unpleasant alternatives. So what we argue is that America, the American establishment, has to establish a hierarchy of priorities and choose between them. But that also involves, of course, recognising which American interests are in fact secondary interests, or even not really interests at all, as we would argue the expansion of NATO in the former Soviet Union. And then on the basis of that, making compromises with regional powers, or with regional concerts, even better, which will allow America to concentrate on what are truly the greatest threats to American security.
Well, I can see why that's realist, because you're talking about making choices and focusing on America's vital interests rather than focusing on the interests of people all around the world. Where is the ethical part of that?
The ethical part comes in two forms. One is that this involves a genuine respect to the opinion of mankind, as the Declaration of Independence has it. It involves an ability to recognise the vital interests of other countries and make accommodations with them, rather than insisting that in every case America is in the right and should prevail. It's also ethical in that a consensual global order of this kind will at least help us, or give us some chance of doing two things. One is dealing with these wider issues, long-term issues of global warming, pandemics and so forth. And the second is creating the kind of international order which will allow economic development and the long-term creation of democracy in many parts of the world.
So let me stop you there for a second. You say a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, and that is, of course, in our own Declaration of Independence. But what I'm hearing is a decent respect for the opinions of other governments, not of their citizens. So when you say of the vital interests of all states, if a government says, well, my vital interest is to pursue stability, and that means killing or repressing millions of my people, what do you do about that?
Well, unfortunately, we live in a world of states. I mean, I wish we didn't. I'm by origin also a liberal internationalist. I would love to see an order based on democratic peoples. The fact is that at the moment these peoples are represented by states. And also, in general, those peoples support their states and their governments in international affairs when it comes to defending their national interests. I mean, even Chinese and Russians, even a great many Arabs and Iranians who deeply disagree with the domestic policies of their governments, support those governments when it comes to defending their national interests and their national pride internationally. And there's no mystery about that. It's the same thing in the United States with many Democrats when they look at their government. The second thing is, I think it's very difficult, and it depends on circumstances. It's not possible to make a universal rule. But I think we have to be extremely careful about mixing up different kinds of authoritarian regimes. I mean, obviously, there are regimes in the world which do not represent their people at all, and which have turned into simply monster states which are looting their countries and transferring the money to us, actually, very often, to Western bank accounts. There are other governments, like those of Russia and China, for example, or even perhaps that of Iran, which are, in fact, representative to a great extent of the views of their people in significant forms, even though they're not fully or indeed at all democratic states.
Well, let me stop you. This sounds familiar. Anybody who's under 40 will have no idea what I'm talking about, but this sounds a lot like Jeane Kirkpatrick back in the beginning of the 1980s, talking about the difference between totalitarians, whom we really have to resist, and authoritarian governments who torture a lot of their people and repress them, but fundamentally they're on our side. I mean, let me put out an alternative approach so that we can get down to some specifics. So I think where we agree is that you cannot promote democracy. Certainly you can't promote it by force. You can't impose it from the outside. It has to come from a domestic forces, from a large-scale social transformation that includes a degree of economic prosperity, that includes checks and balances within the society, that includes an active civil society. There are a lot of ingredients to an effective liberal democracy. So I think you and I agree we can't get there by force. But what we argue in the Princeton Project on national security is to actually say, look, America has to promote liberal democracy, both because those are our values, but in the context of national security, because those are our interests, that America will be safer in a world of strong liberal democracies. But the question is how you get there. And we would argue you get there, first place, collectively. America does not try to do this alone, and there I would agree with you on overstretch. If America tries to do this alone, you produce exactly the opposite result. But we would say you can work with other countries through alliances and through really effective international institutions in ways that will, in fact, support those groups who oppose repressive governments from the inside, to create international standards that can actually be enforced in extreme cases, and at the same time to promote the economic prosperity and the social transformation that is necessary for a long-term process of what we call reaching a world of liberty under law. But that has to be done through radically reformed international institutions, really a very different United Nations, new institutions like a concert of democracies, institutions in the regions, trans-Pacific institutions that engage China and the rest of Asia, and that America, working with other countries in those institutions, can in fact promote these values, which are not only in our interests, but the interests of all countries.
I think there are three issues or elements here mixed together, which, if I may, I'd like to unpick.
Sure.
The first is the long-term promotion of democracy, and democracy as the ultimate goal of the United States in the world. I agree with that completely. No disagreement at all. I think it would be a very good thing for the United States, but also for humanity in general. I also think that stable democracy, successful democracy, can only be promoted through successful economic and social development and institutional development, and above all, reasonably equitable economic development. Because look, I mean, in the United States, you only have to look south across your own border to Latin America to see, frankly, the pointlessness of creating pseudo-democracies in impoverished, grossly unequal societies ruled by predatory elites who have the outward form of democracy.
Are you including Mexico in that?
I'm sorry?
Are you including Mexico?
To a considerable extent, but there have been so many other examples. Venezuela in the 1970s and 1980s, for example.
Okay.
All the outward forms of democracy, but none of the reality. My fear is, you see, that if one concentrates, if one mixes up the long-term creation of democracy with the short-term creation of democratic institutions, which frankly is what so much of the American establishment does, Freedom House, the National Endowment for Democracy, you may well create more of these pseudo-democracies. The Philippines is another example, Russia in the 1990s. And not merely does this not actually advance true democracy, but as we've seen again and again historically, Russia is a mild example of this. Germany in the 1930s, or Italy in the 1920s, was an extreme example. When democracies collapse, it's like Shakespeare, lilies that fester smell much worse than weeds. You can then get a much more dangerous, aggressive, populist, even fascist government coming out.
It is wonderful to have you quoting Shakespeare, national security strategy, but you and I agree on the first two principles. Actually, and the neoconservatives agree on the first one, that promoting democracy, as you said, is in the long-term interest of the United States and of all countries. So we agree on that. You and I agree, I'm not sure that neoconservatives would agree, but you and I agree that process has to pay as much attention, as you put it, to social and economic transformation and institution building as the forms of democracy. So we actually agree on both of those. And we also agree that to do it wrong is probably worse than not doing it at all, because you not only get a huge counter-reaction in failed democracies, but actually you get a counter-reaction in the United States, and you get well, we can't do it, so we swing all the way back to isolationism. So where do we disagree? It's the third point of how do we then effectively promote democracy over the long term, working to promote the long-term economic, social, and institutional development in different countries. And I argue you do that directly through our own policies and international institutions. And what I'm hearing from you is that you say, no, you sort of don't pay attention to what's happening within states. You just let economics work. You have what you call a reasonably just international order, and at some point things will come right.
Well, not entirely. I think that there are abuses so gross that the international community has to intervene. I draw a pretty restrictive limit around those, and I say that it is essential that we have a regional consensus on our side, as we did with the Yugoslav conflict. I mean, for me, that was the critical thing which allowed us to intervene successful and also justified our intervention.
When you say regional, you mean NATO or
NATO,
closer?
the European Union,
yeah.
A consensus of all the major powers in Europe, all the countries in Europe except for Russia. But because everybody else was agreed, Russia could be isolated.
Right.
That the difference between what we did in Iraq or what we would be facing in Darfur could hardly be more stark. But I would say on that score that here I think perhaps we do differ. That I represent an Anglo-American tradition, of whom the most eloquent and most quoted representative is, of course, President Adams, which does believe that the most important thing that we can do to promote democracy in the world is to maintain the power of our successful example. That, after all, it was this which wrecked communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in the end, that they could simply see that the Western democratic systems were better in every way. More just, fairer, more prosperous, freer, more law-abiding, everything. Now, I mean, that is one of my most fundamental reasons for anger with the Bush administration, that they have compromised the American example in the world to such an extent. But
and would you say that to, if you were talking to a group of Poles or to a group of Russians about the Cold War, that really all we should have been doing, or a group of Czechs or a group of Hungarians, any number of countries that actually have made transitions, that we should simply, hold up our example, support their governments, and hope that over the long term they'll rise up?
No, not support their governments. There's become a dangerous trope, I think, in internationalist thinking, which says that by trading with a country, by going in for normal diplomatic relations and economic exchange, we are supporting that country. We're not. Support means aid. Development aid, military backing, alliances. I'm certainly not advocating that we should give economic aid and have military alliances with countries which oppress and loot their own people, except, let's be honest, where they are absolutely essential to our security, as in parts of the Muslim world. I mean, on the business of the Cold War and relations with the Soviet Union and its bloc, my father was the head of the BBC East European services, which, of course, existed precisely to preach the example of the West to the subjects of the Soviet Empire, and ultimately with great success. And that is something which, as his son, I'm extremely proud of. So
that's soft power, and that's exactly, you're saying, well, okay, we trade with them. We use, it's Joe Nye's concept of soft power, where we use communications, information, exchanges, ways of actually supporting and encouraging people within those countries. But let's get to a hard example, because one of the things people are going to accuse you and John and me of is, you've got these strategies. You call it ethical realism. We call it forging a world of liberty under law. But what do you do in concrete cases? So let's take China. You and I both agree, I think, that we should continue trading with China. We both agree that improving China's economic prosperity is improving the lives of millions and millions and millions of people in ways that will, long term, we both think, help create a foundation for a stable liberal democracy in China. But let's imagine that next year, or in the next few months, that what happens here is North Korea has detonated a nuclear device. Japan responds by becoming increasingly nationalist and talking about having a Japanese nuclear weapon. The Chinese, that produces tremendous anti-Japanese sentiment in China, which we certainly have seen. The Chinese government gets worried that it can't control that sentiment and cracks down really strictly in ways that then involve killing, jailing, not sort of a small number of dissenters, but much more widespread repression. Now, what do we do in that setting? Do we just ignore it and continue to trade with them and hope this will change? Do we sanction them? I think you and I would both agree that we don't sanction them, but what do we do? What does ethical realism say we do in that setting?
Well, can I turn the question round?
Sure.
You've posited a situation in which the Chinese government is facing serious unrest, characterized above all by intense anti-Japanese chauvinism and populism. Do we support that?
Do we support serious unrest?
Well, I mean, but particularly serious unrest in the name of a more chauvinist, nationalist, perhaps militarist China with a very strong anti-Japanese character.
So
do we
it's a
support
great question.
that?
No, we don't. I mean, you and I would both agree also that what happens if you promote democracy without thinking about the social foundations of democracy, you're more likely to get nationalism than anything else, and certainly more. You're likely to get nationalism than sort of liberal Democrats, and that's very dangerous. But my response would be, the danger of that situation is we don't have the tools to deal with it, because the United States alone is not going to be able to do anything. Right now, we would work through international institutions. We'd call for sanctions. Other countries would disagree with sanctions because their trading interests are involved, and we wouldn't be able to do anything. What I would argue for is, A, you reform the Security Council, so you've got a Security Council that includes India and Japan and Germany and two African states, so that Japan's actually on the Security Council facing China, and you create a set of East Asian institutions that can support China in some ways so that it feels less insecure, but in other ways can pressure it to respond to this kind of nationalist sentiment in ways that helps drain the nationalist part of it, but does not then create massive repression.
Look, I entirely agree with all that. I'm not against that at all. I would just say, though, that there is an East Asian organisation which seems to be playing quite a useful role in this regard. The only problem is we're not part of it. It's the Shanghai Cooperation Council. On that score, I would just say that one thing I really, really think we have to learn is that we don't have to be part of everything. We certainly don't have to dominate everything. The second thing I would say is, I sometimes think often at meetings on China, on Pakistan, on many other parts of the world, that I'm the only person in the room who doesn't think that he or she could be president of China. In the end, I do not know how to govern China. I don't think I'd be very good at it. In fact, I know I wouldn't be good at it. I'd be a disaster at it. Ditto for Russia and many other countries. The governments of these places are extremely complex. And let us be honest. I spent many years in India, as did my mother's family. India is a democracy. Governing India at ground level is an extremely brutal business, given the realities of Indian political culture, the behaviour of the police, the behaviour of groups to each other, and so forth. You see, I mean, I couldn't govern India, I couldn't govern China. I don't know how to do this. I also really, within certain limits, which I've described, do not think that it is my business. Now, the second point, leading on from that...
Wait a minute, let me stop you on the first one, because it's a critical point. Look, again, there's a lot of agreement that, American arrogance is disastrous on multiple counts. On the other hand, and I agree, I don't think I can govern China. I believe the government of China has got a huge set of issues, and they are in fact trying to modernize China to bring economic prosperity to their people. On the other hand, when you talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, this is China and India and Kazakhstan, and essentially their governments that have very little respect for the rights of their people. And if we are, how do we know that this isn't like Saddam Hussein, or this isn't like Germany before Hitler rose, where what you've got are, or for that matter, Milosevic, places that say, well, we have to keep our country together. We have to do it this way. We have to govern Iraq this way, because if we didn't, Iraq would fall apart. So we are going to kill millions of people. We're going to jail thousands and thousands of people. We're going to prevent individuals who believe differently from what we believe from speaking or acting or having a normal life. That's not a view that I think Americans, or Europeans for that matter, can simply stand by and say, that's fine, go ahead, we're going to have, as you put it in your book, a reasonably just international order, and we're just going to let you do that. I mean, from a political point of view, I would say that's disastrous because it's not sustainable in the United States, because sooner or later, dissident groups either capture public imagination, or those governments go so far that they do horrible things to their people, and then we end up overreacting in the way we intervene. So we need to figure out how you address those individuals who say to you, Anatol, you've just consigned me and my family and a million other people to jail or far worse while you talk to my government.
I haven't done anything. I'm not Chinese. I'm not a Chinese citizen. It's not my responsibility. I'm not a member of the Chinese government. I'm not a member of the Chinese parliament. I may wish different forces in China well, but the fact of the matter is, once again, in the last resort, what happens within America, what Americans think is important, but it isn't all important. In the end, we have to acknowledge that we do not know everything about what happens in many parts of the world. This has been most glaringly demonstrated in recent years by our utter incomprehension and lack of knowledge of much of what happens in the Muslim world and what Muslims think. But the second thing is, our host, Bob Wright, once said, very well, I thought, about many human rights groups in the United States, that they would rather get 3 dissidents out of jail than save 3 million people from starvation. There are trade-offs to be made here between order and development and human rights in individual cases. Now, Burke said that circumstances are what count for everything. One cannot make absolute rules here. I am for the isolation and, where possible, and in extreme cases, the overthrow of governments which commit genocide on their territory, or even short of genocide, carry out really monstrous abuses against their own people, and certainly against neighbours. I mean, whenever a state steps outside its own borders and starts to promote anarchy and bloodshed, then of course the international community has an absolute right and duty to intervene, as we did in the first Iraq War. But I am not prepared to say that in the end what counts for most, as you have just implied, is what so-called American public opinion thinks, which in these cases is often not public opinion. It's seriously, it's just anyone who can, seize the ear of Congress.
No, you misunderstood me. I'm not talking. You and I agree that we fundamentally agree, which I think is where we disagree quite fundamentally with many people in the current administration, although not everyone, that liberal democracy has to be built from the bottom up, that you cannot impose it, and Americans, whatever they think, cannot simply achieve it through economic means, or certainly not through military means. What I was talking about was that a policy that, as you're putting it, whether it's realism, whether it's ethical or not, goes back to a Kissingerian policy in the 1970s, where effectively we were supporting a lot of governments that were doing really terrible things. And from right and left in the United States, you got a whole group of people saying, we cannot do this. This is inconsistent with who we are to be supporting governments, as you put it, dealing with governments not actively helping people on the ground who are trying to fight for their individual rights. So if you put it, 3 dissidents versus millions of people, well, all right, government is to govern is to choose, and you probably have to say you help those 3 million people, or those millions of people. But if you are then talking about a government that is ethnic cleansing, let's start with that. It's not crimes against humanity. It's not genocide. Government is simply moving people out of their homes, isolating them, putting them in concentration camps, doing what Slobodan Milosevic was doing before he crossed a border. At that point, what do? Do we stand by? Or do we actually say, the United States, Europe, other liberal democracies, India, South Africa, Brazil, no, you actually have a responsibility to your people, and we are here to insist on it, not as the United States, but as a group of nations in the global order. That's the difference.
But there are 2 issues here. You mentioned Latin America in the 1970s and 80s, but the point there was that the United States was actually massively backing the governments that were doing this. Not just that, but in several cases, from Guatemala in the 1950s through to Chile in 1971, the United States had created or backed coups d'etats which brought these wicked governments to power. Now that I am completely against. But you must see there is a different issue there from our direct responsibility in this case for backing, for supporting, even for creating governments which then carry out atrocities.
But there's only one step between your position and backing, and it goes like this. So we say, we're not going to back you because you're doing really nasty things, but we're certainly not going to try to upset you. But then what happens is the government says to us, as the Egyptian government is saying to us right now, you have to support us, because if you don't support us, if you don't give us aid, if you don't give us help in a whole lot of ways, we are going to get overthrown by a really nasty group. In the 1970s, that was communist groups. And so the Latin American government said to the U.S. government, if you don't give us aid, we will be overthrown by a communist group. Today in the Middle East, it is, if you don't give us aid and support us, we'll be overthrown by an Islamist group. And in China and other countries, similarly, the argument is, if you don't actually help us, not China, because China can do it on its own, we actually then will be destabilized. And you, Anatol, an ethical realist position says we don't want instability. And that leads you to actually supporting these governments. How do you not, if they say that?
Look, you mentioned Egypt, but Egypt is not carrying out ethnic cleansing. It's not carrying out genocide or mass killings. It's a moderate authoritarian regime. We back it, not just because of the fear of Islamism, but also the aid to Egypt was a part of Egypt's treaty with Israel. It's part of the guarantee that that Egypt will remain part of what, for some reason, we choose to call the peace process. It's also, of course, a way of keeping the Suez Canal open for international trade, but also for American military transports.
But that's only temporary. We're backing a government that is, in fact, so denying its people through both corruption and through political repression, through hounding judges, through preventing any kind of legitimate democratic expression, not to mention economic opportunity. What's happening is, for now, there's stability, but we're actually fueling a much more radical alternative, which is the Muslim Brotherhood, which is much more radical Islam. And if you talk to human rights activists, democracy activists in Egypt, they will say you must help them create a middle way. And that's back to my question. Can we find a way that helps those people whom, Anatol, if you met, you would say, of course we've got to try to find a way to help these people? Or do we simply say, look, it's up to you guys, deal with your own government, and we'll support that government because we don't want some kind of Muslim Brotherhood overthrow?
Look, on the other hand, do you want a Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt? If you introduce full open democracy today, the overwhelming chances are that is what you will get.
I
now,
agree with
you
that.
know what that will mean for relations with Israel, for peace in the Middle East, for support for terrorism and everything else. Do you want that? If so, by all means introduce democracy now. I don't want that.
I don't want that either, but so I say we should work with governments collectively to bring them up to par. So we talk about popular, accountable rights regarding government. So what I would say to the Egyptian government is you have to become more representative. We don't call for absolute democracy. We say you've got to become more popular government. That means more representative. You've got to open up various elections. You have to be much more accountable. Now that's an issue of corruption as much as anything else, and you push them really hard to develop mechanisms whereby if they don't deliver to the people, they are accountable to the people. And then you push them really hard on rights. And if you push them on those three, you're actually addressing the social transformation that has to take place. You don't go in and say, let's have elections. There we agree. But I think the difference is I would push really hard on those three, and what I'm hearing is you would say no.
No, on the contrary, I'm for all those things. But what I've said repeatedly is, I'm for all those things if you are prepared to allow them to take a considerable time to develop. I mean, from that point of view, as I've often said, I'm a Whig, not a revolutionary. I believe this takes time.
You have to explain Whig, I think. It's not clear to everybody what that means.
Anyway, it's to do with the development of the English and American constitutional systems.
Nice, long, slow processes.
Yeah. But the problem is, as I've said again and again, that you say all this, and I entirely agree with it. And then, suddenly, after all, in somewhere like Pakistan, for example, it turns out that it's not about building institutions over time or building accountability or tackling corruption. No, it's all about free and fair elections next year, which I would say, given the social, economic, elite realities and violent realities of Pakistani society, you cannot have at the moment, no matter what the constitution says, no matter what the role of the army. Are you prepared to allow a generation for these things to work in Pakistan and Egypt before we have full democracy? Or in the end, is it always going to come back to free and fair elections next year or the year after? You see, because the problem is that the whole American system is integrated with these bodies like Freedom House and the National Endowment of Democracy, which are just not calibrated to think about issues like equitable development, for example. It always comes back to this absurd phrase, I'm sorry to say absurd in many parts of the world, given present realities, free and fair elections. The problem is, of course, that in reality, you talked about the reality of how, within American politics, there will always be powerful groups which will insist on us putting pressure on other countries from the point of view of respect for human rights. I agree. The problem is that American reality and congressional reality also means that this pressure will always be heavily biased in favour of pressure on countries which are seen as America's rivals or enemies, and heavily biased in favour of countries which are seen as American allies. Now, this has created an impression in very large parts of the world, that of complete hypocrisy, that this is almost a Soviet communist-style way of attacking countries which America doesn't like, while letting America's allies off the hook. And I think you have to recognise that the reality of America is that will also be the case. And I have to say that, therefore, I would prefer to lower the entire atmosphere of pressure from this kind of thing. But let me say once again that when you talk about building institutions, accountability, anti-corruption, equitable development, all these things, I am with you 100%. But I would say that every lesson of history is that these things, in most cases, East Europe being a particular exception, in most cases these things take a long time to develop.
So we're just about out of time, and we're going to have to come back to debate, I think, the following things. Where we agree is we certainly agree that the current strategy of promoting democracy is not working, and worse than not working, is actively counterproductive. We agree that long-term we must promote liberal democracy. We agree that requires social, economic, and political change that is long and slow. Where we may disagree are on a number of very specific questions about what do you do when over that long period governments actually cross some line between being what I think you'd call a benign dictatorship, and I would call a government that has some elements of at least economic prosperity and some institutions, but is still far short of a popular, accountable, and rights-regarding government. We ought to talk about what do you do concretely in a number of cases where the time, maybe in 50 years it may be fine, but at year 5 or year 10 you've got a big problem. And then the real question, and I think this may be where we also differ, is how do you build the international institutions and the regional institutions that will help you? That it cannot be America alone. It can't be America and a coalition of the willing. But America can play a really important role with Europe building these institutions. John Eikenberry and I recommend that one of those institutions be a concert of democracies. I think you disagree with that, but I think we're going to have to come back and debate that second half of this proposition.
But absolutely, I would look forward to that. As I say, just on a concluding note, I do believe that actually our ultimate goals are the same. One of the things that we haven't talked about is nationalism in the world. Historically, unfortunately, but truly, nationalism has often been a critical part of initially creating mass politics and ultimately democratic politics. The problem is, as we know from bitter experience, is that nationalism is a double-edged sword. And unfortunately, nationalism expressed through democracy can, as Jack Snyder and Ed Mansfield have argued, in the short to medium term actually make a lot of things very much worse. I witnessed during the collapse of the Soviet Union, particularly in the Caucasus, how, really democratic mass movements led to a set of small but extremely savage wars in that region. We saw the same thing on an even larger scale in the Balkans. And my fear about the whole concert of democracy idea is that once again, to get in particular parts of the world, this would in fact turn into backing some nations against other nations, which would actually make international relations and the promotion of democracy a great deal harder and even more violent.
Well, let us close on that. You have a wonderful phrase in your book where you talk about disillusionment with U.S. strategy, and in particular with its mixture of militarization and messianic belief in American superiority. And we, I think, both agree that this kind of missionary idea where you're going to be able to bring democracy and suddenly things are going to come right, in fact, you're often opening a Pandora's box of nationalism, ethnic hatred, a whole set of evils that can be much worse than where you started. You saw this in the Caucasus and elsewhere. We also saw, after the Soviet Union fell, 10 countries in Eastern and Central Europe, where Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, Bulgaria, the Latvian countries, where there were nationalist movements. But because of the proximity of the European Union and because of very smart policy by the European Union, those nationalist movements were quelled, and many of those countries are stable liberal democracies. I'd like to come back and talk about whether we can create international institutions that can help us reach that result rather than the miasma of nationalism and ethnic hatred and poverty that mire so many countries. But thanks very much for the conversation. We'll be back. It's Blogging Heads TV.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it.